to the Dream Lantern. The Dream Lantern has found another story for you tonight. Settle in now. Let the day, however it went, become something behind you. Something finished. Something that doesn't need your attention anymore tonight. Let your eyes feel heavy. Let your breathing slow. Let your whole body sink just a little deeper into wherever you are resting. Tonight, we travel to the edge of a coastline that doesn't appear on any map, to a tall, quiet tower standing alone on a wind-swept headland, where the land ends and the sea begins. To the story of the last lantern keeper. There's nothing you need to solve tonight. Nothing you need to remember. Nothing waiting on the other side of this story that cannot simply wait. Let your body sink a little deeper into wherever it is resting. Let your hands grow still. Let your jaw unclench just slightly the way it does in the last few moments before real sleep arrives. Close your eyes and let the tide carry you there, far along a coastline that most sailors only ever glimpsed for a great distance. There stood a headland of dark, weathered stone, tall, lonely, reaching out into a wide, grey-blue sea that stretched further than any eye could follow. And at the very tip of that headland, where the wind never fully stopped blowing, and the waves never fully stopped their slow, patient work against the rocks below, there stood a tower, old, round, built from the same dark stone as the headland itself, as if it had grown up out of the rock, rather than being placed there. Its name was the Ember Tower, and at its very top, behind a wide, curved window of thick, salt-clouded glass, there burned a lantern. Not an ordinary lantern, a slow, deep amber light that never flickered, that never dimmed, that had been burning so long that no living person could say with certainty when it had first been lit. This was not a light for ships, or rather, it was not only a light for ships. The tower itself rose in a long, slow spiral of dark, weathered stone, worn smooth in places by centuries of south wind and driving rain. At its base, small, round rooms opened one into the next, each one warmed by a low, quiet hearth, and furnished simply with the sturdy, unhurried furniture that generations of keepers had built and mended and passed gently along. A narrow wooden stair wound upward through the tower's center. 211 steps, worn into soft, shallow curves by so many patient feet over so many patient years, that each step had come to hold its own particular shape, the exact shape of a foot, descending or climbing in no particular hurry. Small, round windows dotted the tower's length at irregular intervals, each one framing a brief, shifting glimpse of sea or sky, or the pale scattered lights of Merrow's end far below. And at the very top, the lantern room opened into a wide, circular space, ringed entirely by thick, curved glass, so that wherever you stood in that small round room, the sea surrounded you on every side, endless, grey-blue, moving always in its own slow, patient rhythm. The old stories of that coastline said the Ember Tower's light did something that no ordinary lighthouse ever could. They said it guided not only vessels lost in the dark, and the fog, and the heavy grey mist that so often settled over that stretch of sea. They said it guided dreams below the headland, tucked into a small, sheltered cove, where the water grew calm and the wind grew gentle. There lay a fishing village called Merrow's End, a cluster of low, salt-worn cottages, roofs the color of driftwood, walls that had learned over many generations exactly how much wind and rain and sea spray they could hold back, and exactly how much they simply needed to let through. Narrow lanes wound between the cottages, smelling always of salt and wood smoke, and the particular briny sweetness of nets drying in the open air. The people of Merrow's End were fishers, mostly white people, withered the way rope and wood, and the old sails become withered by many years of honest patient work. They rose before dawn, not hurried, simply early, moving through the dark, quiet lanes toward the small harbor with the unhurried certainty of people who have done the same thing every morning for their entire lives and have never once needed to rush it. They rowed out into the grey, pre-dawn water, cast their nets, waited with particular patient stillness that fishing teaches anyone who practices it for long enough. And always behind them, above them, watching over the whole quiet business of their morning, stood the Ember Tower. Its light still burning, faint now against the growing daylight. But there, always there, the people of Merrow's End rarely spoke of the tower directly. It was simply part of their world, the way the tide was part of their world, the way the particular cold, clean smell of the sea at dawn was part of their world. Something so constant, so entirely woven into the fabric of their days that it hardly needed mentioning. But every child in Merrow's End grew up knowing one simple thing: the tower's light must never go dark. There was a particular unhurried rhythm to life in Merrow's End that outsiders who occasionally wandered into the village along the long coastal road always noticed almost immediately. A softness in the way people moved, a patience in the way they spoke. The Hallow family, who had fished that same stretch of water for 6 generations, still mended their nets by hand in the evenings, sitting on low wooden stools outside their small salt-worn cottage, talking quietly as their fingers moved through the familiar, practiced motions. Old Bartlem, who kept the village's only tavern, poured ale slowly and listened more than he spoke, and remembered without ever writing anything down the particular small details of everyone's life that made each person feel truly known. The bakery near the harbor, run by a white, warm woman named Cressa, filled the narrow lanes each morning with the smell of dark, seeded bread and the particular sweet warmth of cinnamon and dried sea-salted honey. Children ran along the harbor wall in the late afternoons, teasing girls that never seemed particularly troubled by the chasing. And every evening, without fail, the whole quiet village turned its collective, unspoken attention toward the tip of the headland, waiting for the light, not anxiously, not with any real doubt that it would come, but the way you wait for a friend you already know will arrive, with quite certain warmth. And when the light appeared, glowing softly first and then more steadily. Against the darkening sky, a particular settled feeling moved through the village. Something close to relief. So nothing had truly been in danger. Something close to gratitude. So no one could quite say to whom exactly that gratitude was owed. Once each year, on the longest evening of summer, the village held a small, quiet festival. Not a loud celebration, not the kind of festival with drums or shouting or bright, hurried lights, but a gentle, unhurried gathering on the harbor wall as the sun made its own long, golden descent toward the western hills. Each family carried a small paper lantern of their own making, folded from thin, pale paper and lit with a single small candle inside. And as the sky deepened toward evening, they set their small lanterns gently onto the calm, sheltered water of the cove. Watching them drift slowly outward, small, warm, golden points scattered across the darkening water like a second floating sky. It was said that this small tradition had begun long ago as a way of honoring Marine and her first small fire on the tip of the lonely headland. A way of saying quietly, together, without needing many words, thank you for the light that had watched over them for so many generations. Elowen watched this festival every year from the great curved window of the lantern room, looking down at the small scattered lights drifting on the dark water below and feeling a particular quiet warmth spread through her chest, knowing that the light she tended and the small floating lights of the village below were, in their own different ways, doing exactly the same patient, quiet work. The keeper of the Ember Tower in those days was a woman named Elowen. She had lived in the tower for nearly 40 years, since she was a young woman, barely more than a girl, who had climbed the long spiral stair for the very first time, following her own mother who had been keeper before her. Elowen's hands were withered now, lined with a particular careful crease that come from many years of small, precise work, trimming wicks, polishing glass, carrying oil up a long flights of worn stone stairs without ever once spilling a drop. Her hair had gone the color of sea foam. Her eyes had gone, the color of deep water on a calm day. She moved through the tower and the small stone rooms. At its base where she lived with the quiet, unhurried grace of someone who has learned every step, every worn groove in every stair so thoroughly that her feet no longer needed her eyes to guide them. Each evening, as the light outside began its slow golden fade, Elowen climbed the spiral stairs, round and round and round, passing small, narrow windows that framed brief, shifting glimpses of the sea, growing darker and darker with each turn of the stair, until she reached the very top, the lantern room, where the great curved window looked out over the entire wide darkening sea, and where the lantern itself waited, steady, warm, its deep amber light filling the small round room with a particular settled kind of warmth that had nothing to do with ordinary fire. She tended it the way her mother had taught her, the way her mother's mother had taught her mother before that, trimming the long, slow-burning wick with a small silver blade, worn smooth by generations of careful hands, polishing the thick glass until it held no smudge, no smear, nothing to dim or scatter the lantern's steady light, kicking the great curved lens behind the flame that gathered and focused and sent the light out across the water in one long unbroken beam. And then she sat on a low wooden stool, worn smooth by generations of keepers before her, and watched the light do what it had always done. No one in Merrow's End could say exactly what would happen if the lantern ever went dark. The old stories spoke of it only carefully, in hushed, careful tones, the way people speak of things they would rather not name too directly. But everyone agreed on this much. The Ember Tower's light did not simply guide ships safely past the sharp, hidden rocks that lay beneath the water near the headland. It did something gentler, something harder to explain. They said that far out at sea on the darkest nights, when sailors and travelers and anyone far from home closed their tired eyes to sleep, the light of the Ember Tower found them, not as an ordinary light finds a ship, but as a soft, warm presence somewhere at the very edge of their dreams. A steady, distant glow that told them quietly that home was still exactly where they had left it. That someone, somewhere was still tending the light. That however far they had traveled, however lost they might feel in that particular dark and uncertain moment, there was still a steady patient warmth waiting for them to return to. Sailors spoke of this in quiet taverns, in distant ports, of a dream that arrived on the roughest nights. A dream of a tale, dark tower and a warm amber light, and a feeling of being gently and completely safe. They did not always know where the dream came from, but they slept more easily after it, and woke feeling somehow less alone in the wide, uncertain sea around them. There was a sailor once named Bram who told this story in a small, smoky tavern in a port many days sail from Merrow's end. He had been caught in a terrible storm, far from any familiar coast. His ship, tossed by waves taller than the mast itself, rain driving sideways so hard it stung like small cold needles against exposed skin. For 3 days and 3 nights, he and his crew had fought the storm with little rest and less certainty that they would see land again. On the 3rd night, exhausted beyond what he had believed a person could endure, Bram had finally slept. Not a deep sleep, not a restful one, but in the brief, fitful moments his body forced upon him, he dreamed of a pale, dark tower, standing calm and steady on a distant rocky headland of a warm amber light at its very top that did not waver or dim, no matter how hard the wind seemed to blow against it, or a feeling spreading slowly through his chest that he had not felt in 3 long frightening days. Calm, not the absence of danger. The storm in his dream was still there, still raging, but somehow alongside it this steady patient light, unmoved, unshaken, watching over him and everyone else out there in that same wide dark water. He woke before dawn to find the storm finally beginning to ease, and though he had never in his life sailed anywhere near Merrow's end, and had never once laid eyes on the Ember Tower, something in him knew without quite knowing how that the light in his dream was real. Years later, an old, withered sailor by then, Bram finally made the long journey to that quiet coastline. Just to see it, he stood on the small, rocky harbor of Merrow's End and looked up at the tall, dark tower and the warm amber light glowing at its very top, and felt the same calm spreading slowly through his chest that he had felt on that terrible third night so many years before. He never spoke to Elowen directly. He simply stood for a long while on the harbor wall and looked up and quietly whispered a single word of thanks into the salt evening air. And then he continued on his way. Elowen had grown up hearing these stories and had grown into the particular quiet certainty that comes from knowing your work, however small it might seem to others, matters in a way that reaches far beyond what you can see. She had never married, had never had children of her own to pass the keeping on to. For many years, this had felt like a quiet private sorrow, a small unanswered question at the edge of her days. But as the years passed, the sorrow softened, the way most sorrows soften when they are given enough patient time and enough gentle attention. She came to feel instead a kind of wide, quiet love, not for any single person, but for all of them. Every sailor she would never meet, every traveler whose dream her light would find on some dark, distant night, every person in Merrow's End whose quiet and remarkable days her steady light made just slightly safer. She had come to think of them as a kind of family, vast, scattered, mostly unseen, but hers nonetheless. By day, Elowen kept a small garden in the sheltered lee of the tower, where the wind could not quite reach. She thrived mostly. Small, hardy, pink flowers that seemed to thrive on very little. A few low, twisted, salt-tolerant herbs that she used for tea in the evenings, and sometimes for small, quiet gifts to the families of Merrow's End. He tended this garden the same unhurried way she tended everything else, kneeling in the soft, sandy soil for long, patient stretches of quiet, careful work. It was here, in her small garden, more than almost anywhere else, that she felt most at rest. The lantern above her demanded her steady, careful attention, but the garden asked for nothing at all. It simply grew in its own unhurried way, and she simply watched it grow, which she had come to understand was its own particular form of rest. There was a boy in Merrow's End named Finn, who visited the tower often. He was 11, small for his age, with quick, curious eyes and a habit of asking questions that most adults in the village found mentally exhausting, but that Elowen always found rather wonderful. He had lost his father to the sea 2 winters before, a sudden, violent storm, a boat that never returned. His mother still fished most mornings, quiet now in a way she had not been before, carrying her grief the way most people in Merrow's End carried their grief, steadily, without much complaint, folded into the ordinary daily business of continuing. Finn climbed the long spiral stair most evenings after his chores were finished, and sat on the low stone ledge beneath the great carved window of the lantern door, and watched Elowen tend the light. He rarely spoke much during these visits. He simply watched the slow, careful movements of her withered hands, the steady amber glow of the lantern, the wide, dark sea stretching beyond the glass, dotted here and there with the small, distant lights of fishing boats making their slow way home. One evening, he finally asked the question he had clearly been carrying for some time. Does the light find him? He did not need to say who he meant. Elowen was quiet for a long moment, turning the small silver blade over in her withered hands. I believe, she said finally, that wherever he is sleeping tonight, the light finds its way to him. That it always finds its way to everyone who needs it, even the ones we cannot see anymore. Finn was quiet for a while after that, watching the lantern's steady glow, and something in his small, serious face seemed to settle, just slightly, the way a held breath settles when it is finally released. As Finn grew older, his visits to the tower changed slowly in their character. He was no longer simply a boy sitting quietly on a stone ledge watching. He began to help. At first, small tasks, carrying oil up the long spiral stair, sweeping the small round rooms at the base of the tower, then larger ones. Elowen taught him the particular careful angle at which a wick should be trimmed, the exact gentle pressure needed to polish glass without scratching it. Slower, she told him often in those early lessons, when his young, eager hands moved too quickly through the careful, patient work. The light has never once been in a hurry. There is no reason for you to be either. Finn learned in time exactly what she meant, that the keeping was not a task to be finished quickly and set aside. It was a practice, repeated, unhurried, something you did not complete so much as simply continue. By the time he was 17, he could tend the lantern entirely on his own. Elowen watched him sometimes from the low stone ledge herself now, the way he had once watched her, and felt a particular quiet pride settle into her chest, knowing that the light would continue long after her own hands grew too tired to tend it. The seasons along that coastline moved with their own particular patient rhythm. In spring, the wind softened. The sea turned a pale, gentle green, dotted with small, drifting patches of foam, while the flowers, small and hardy, and the color of early sunrise, pushed up between the cracks in the headland's dark stone. The fishing boats went out further in spring, returning in the late afternoons, heavy with silver-scaled fish that caught the light like small scattered coins. In summer, the days grew long and warm and golden. The sea turned a deep, brilliant blue that seemed almost to glow from somewhere beneath its surface. Children from the village swam in the calm, sheltered waters of the cool, their laughter drifting up the headland, mixing with the cry of gulls and the slow, steady rhythm of the waves. On the warmest summer evenings, Elowen left the great covered windows of the lantern room open a small crack so that the low, distant sound of the village below, the soft laughter, the clinking of dishes, the far-off murmur of quiet conversation drifted gently up the long spiral stairway and settled into the warm amber room alongside her and the lantern's steady glow. Some summer nights brought fog, thick, slow-moving, rolling in from the open water until the whole headland seemed to disappear into a soft, grey nothing. On these nights, the lantern mattered more than ever. Its light could not always pierce the thickest fog entirely, but it did not need to. It simply glowed softly, steadily, somewhere within the grey, becoming a warm, hazy point that sailors could still somehow sense even when they could not clearly see it. A presence more than a light, a knowing more than a seeing. In autumn, The wind grew sharp again. The sea turned a restless slate gray. Storms came more often, rolling in from the wide, open water, dark and heavy, and full of a particular electric quality that made the whole coastline feel briefly alive in a different, wilder way. And it was on these autumn nights, more than any other, that the Ember Tower's light mattered most. Elowen climbed the spiral stairs on this night more often than usual, checking the lantern, checking the great carved lens, making certain that no wind, no rain, no wild autumn storm stayed the flame. There was one autumn night in particular that the people of Merrow's End still spoke of quietly for years afterward. A sudden violent storm that arrived faster than any the Fishers had ever seen. 3 small boats were caught out on the water far from the safety of the harbor when the wind turned and the waves rose dark and steep and the whole sky went black with driving rain. In the village below, families gathered on the harbor wall, straining to see any sign of the small, struggling boats out in that wild, churning dark. Elowen climbed the spiral stair that night, faster than she had in years. And at the very top, she did the only thing she could do. She tended the light, trimmed the wick until the flame burned as steady and as bright as it possibly could, polished the glass until no smudge, no smell could dim its reach, adjusted the great curved lens, turning slowly and carefully, sending its long, steady beam sweeping out across the dark, storm-tossed water. Hour after hour, she sat on her low wooden stool and watched and waited and trusted in the only thing she had ever needed to trust, that the light would find them, and one by one, through the long terrible night, the 3 small boats found their way back into the sheltered harbor, guided the Fishers said afterward not by sight exactly, for the wind had made seeing almost impossible, but by a feeling, a steady, warm, certain pull toward somewhere safe. The last boat to return carried a young fisherman named Cole, who later told anyone who would listen that in the worst moments of that storm, when he had been certain he would not survive, he had closed his eyes just for a moment and seen clearly the warm amber light of the tower in his mind, and had simply steered toward that feeling until the real light finally appeared through the driving rain exactly where he had felt it would be. The village never forgot that night, and Elowen, though she never spoke of it, often carried a particular quiet pride in her chest for the rest of days, knowing that her steady, patient tending of a small, unassuming flame had that night brought 3 boats and everyone aboard them safely home. Colin himself never forgot that night either. Each year on its particular anniversary, he made the long climb up the pirate stair, carrying a small jar of preserved honey or a warm loaf of precious dark, seeded bread, or whatever small simple gift felt right that year. He rarely said much. He simply set the gift on the low stone ledge near the great carved window and sat for a while in comfortable silence beside Elowen watching the light. And before leaving, he always said the same quiet words: "Thank you for finding me." And Elowen gave the same quiet answer: "The light found you, I only kept it burning." And in winter, snow sometimes dusted the headland, softening the sharp, dark edges of the rocks, settling in quiet drifts along the narrow lengths of Merrow's end. The sea in winter grew a deep, cold, brooding color, but the tower's light burned exactly as steadily as it always had. A single warm, amber point against the vast dark winter sea, visible for miles, a promise that some things endure however hard the winter tries. Old Bartlam, who kept the village tavern, had a small quiet ritual of his own each winter night before closing his doors. He stepped outside into the cold still air and looked up toward the tip of the headland and found the light just for a moment. He never said why he did it. If anyone had asked him, he might have simply shrugged and said it was a habit, nothing more. But in truth, it was something closer to a small private prayer, a quiet wordless way of saying good night, not only to his own small warm tower, but to the whole sleeping village below and the whole wide dark sea beyond it. Many of the older residents of Merrow's End shared this same quiet habit. A last look toward the light before closing their eyes for the night. A small, wordless way of remembering that whatever the night might bring, someone was still watching, still tending, still patient. There was an older story that Elowen's mother had told her many years before about the very first keeper of the Ember Tower, a woman named Marin who had lived so long ago that her story had by now become something closer to legend than history. Marin, the story said, had once been a sailor herself. She had loved a man from a distant coastal town who sailed often into the deep, uncertain waters far beyond the last familiar shore. One winter, his ship did not return. Marin waited through the whole long dark winter, watching the horizon each evening from the very tip of the headland, hoping for some small distant sign of his sail. He never came. But something in Marin's long, patient watching changed her. She began to understand the sea differently, not as a place that had simply taken someone she loved, but as a vast, dark, uncertain space full of countless other people just like her, waiting for someone they loved to find their way home. And so she built a small fire at the very tip of the headland, not for any single ship, but for all of them. The sailor out on the vast dark water, who needed a steady warm point of light to guide them safely home. The fire grew over the years into a proper tended flame. The flame grew into a small stone tower. The tower grew into the Ember Tower that stands there still. And Marin, the story said, never stopped tending her light. Not because she was waiting still for one particular ship to return, but because somewhere along the long patient years of her waiting, she had come to love all of them. The whole wide scattered family of travelers and sailors and dreamers that her light would never meet, but would always quietly guide. And that love, the stories say, is what truly lit the very first flame in the Ember Tower. Not grief. So grief had been its beginning, but something that grief in time had grown into. Something wider, warmer, something that outlasted the particular sharp edges of loss and became instead a steady, enduring form of care. On the far side of the headland, past even the tower itself, there was a small flat outcrop of dark stone where the very first fire was said to have burned. Nothing marked the spot spatially. No statue, no plaque. Only a small, natural hollow in the rock, worn smooth by wind and salt and time. But every keeper of the Ember Tower, from Marin onward had kept a quite private habit of walking out to that small flat outcrop once a year, usually near the turning of winter into spring, to sit for a while in the cold, clean air. And simply remember, Elowen made this walk every year of her keeping, and Fiora before her, not out of obligation, but because it felt like the right way to remember where the light had first begun, not in a tower, not on a pedestal, but in a small, cold hollow in a rock where one grieving, patient woman had decided that her love was large enough to become a fire that could guide strangers home. Between Maren and Elowen, there had been many keepers. Most their names softened and blurred by time the way most names eventually do. But one Elowen remembered clearly, her own mother, a quiet, steady woman named Fiora. Fiora had taught Elowen everything she knew about the keeping. Not through the slow, unhurried rhythm of checking the great curved lanes each night before settling onto the low wooden stool to watch. Fiora had a habit to find her mother still sitting on the stool, still watching the light, still humming her same low wandering tune. Fiora kept the tower for nearly 50 years, and when her own time came to let go, she did so the way Elowen would one day always do. Quietly, in the lantern room, watching the light she had tended for so long do exactly what it had always done. Elowen was 22 that winter, young still, but already deeply familiar with the long spiral stair and the particular patient rhythms of keeping. She grieved her mother deeply, but she also understood almost immediately without needing anyone to explain it exactly what must happen next. She climbed the stair that same evening and trimmed the wick and polished the glass and sat on the low wooden stool, still warm from her mother's own recent sitting, and began without quite meaning to humming softly to herself the same low wandering tune she had fallen asleep to so many nights as a child. Elowen often thought of Maren on quiet evenings in the lantern room. She understood now in a way she had not fully understood as a young woman exactly what the old stories meant. That the light was never really about the tower itself, or even about the particular keeper who tended it. It was about the of tending a small steady flame not because anyone was watching, not because anyone would ever know your name, but because somewhere out in the vast uncertain dark, someone needed it. And that was reason enough. One autumn evening, many years into Elowen's long keeping of the tower, a particular quality entered the lantern's light. Not brighter, not dimmer, but deeper. The way a person's voice grows deeper and quieter when they are about to share something important. Elowen paused in her evening, tending, and felt something she could not quite name. Not fear, something gentler, a quiet settling certainty that some long patient chapter of her life was drawing toward its close. Earlier that same evening, Finn, then 19 and well into his own quiet apprenticeship, had shared a simple supper with her in the small warm kitchen at the base of the tower. They had spoken of ordinary things, the mending of a net, a new litter of kittens born in the hollow family's barn, the particular gold quality of that evening's fading light. But near the end of their meal, Elowen had reached across the small worn table and rested her withered hand gently over Finn's. "You have good hands," she told him quietly. "Patient ones. The light will be well kept." Finn had laughed a little at that, not quite understanding why she had chosen that particular moment to say it. "You'll be keeping it yourself for many years yet," he had told her. She had only smiled and patted his hand once gently and said nothing more. Now alone in the lantern room, watching the deepening light, she understood why she had felt the need to say it when she did. She was not a young woman anymore. Her hands had grown slower. Her knees ached more on the long climb up the spiral stair. But that evening she climbed it anyway, one slow, careful step at a time, and reached the lantern room and sat on her low wooden stool and watched the light for a long while. Finn, now a young man of 19, found her there later that night. He had taken to visiting often still, even as a grown man, even as he had begun his own quiet apprenticeship, learning the slow, careful work of tending the light. Found her sitting peacefully on her stool, her withered hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed, her breathing slow, even peaceful. He understood almost immediately what had happened. She had not fallen ill. She had not suffered. She had simply, in the warm amber glow of the light she had tended faithfully for nearly 60 years, closed her eyes and let go. Gently, the way a long patient tide finally turns and slips quietly back out to sea. Finn wept that night, quietly, alone in the lantern room beside her still peaceful form. But even in his grief, he noticed something. The lantern's light had not changed. It burned exactly as the sun was, never truly about any single keeper. It was about the light itself, continuing, passed gently from one patient pair of hands to the next, the way Elowen had received it from her mother, the way her mother had received it from hers, all the way back to Marin and her. First small fire on the tip of a lonely windswept headland. Finn buried Elowen on a quiet grassy slope above the village, where she could still, in her own gentle way, look out over the wide endless sea she had spent her whole life watching over. The whole village came to stand with him that morning, not in loud mourning, but in the same quiet, unhurried way they met most things in Merrow's end. Old Bartram stood near the pack, his weathered cap held against his chest. Pressed about a small, simple loaf of dark-seeded bread, and left it gently on the fresh, turned earth, the way you might leave something for a long journey. Colm stood quietly near the front, his own eyes wet, remembering a storm and a light and a night he had never forgotten. And when the small, simple service was finished, they did not immediately leave. They stood together for a long while on that quiet grassy slope, looking out at the sea and the tower and the small steady point where the lantern, though unlit in daylight, still waited for evening. That evening, for the first time in nearly 60 years, someone other than Elowen climbed the long spiral stair to tend the light. And then, that same evening, as the sun began its slow, golden fade behind the western hills, Finn climbed the long spiral stair, and for the first time alone, trained the wick, polished the glass, checked the great curved lens, and sat on the low wooden stool, worn smooth by generations of keepers before him, and watched the light do what it had always done. Word of Elowen's passing spread slowly through Merrow's end, the way all news in that quiet village spread, gently, without hurry. The fishers who had known her all their lives spoke quietly of her in the small, warm kitchens of their cottage, of her steady hands, her patient watching. The particular warm, unhurried way she had always greeted anyone who climbed the long stairs to visit her. They did not grieve loudly, they grieved the way they did most things in Merrow's End. Steadily, without much complaint, folded gently into the ordinary daily business of continuing. And every evening after that, when the light outside began its slow golden fade, the people of the village looked up toward the tip of the headland and saw the lantern glowing exactly as it always had, and felt a small quiet comfort in knowing that whatever else might change in their lives, that light would continue. Finn kept the tower for many years after that. He grew into the particular unhurried grace that the work seemed always to give its keepers. His hands grew withered, his eyes grew the color of deep water on a calm day.
He married in time, a quiet, kind woman from the village named Tansy, who took quickly to the slow spiral climb and the particular patient rhythms of a life lived half on land and half suspended above a wide, restless sea. Tamsin had grown up in the Hollow family's small cottage near the harbor, the daughter of fishers, comfortable already with soft air and long silences, and the particular patient waiting that a life near the sea always seems to require. She had watched the tower's lights her whole life from her own small window without ever imagining that she would one day tend it herself. When Finn first brought her up the long spiral stair, she had paused at the very top before the great curved window and simply stood for a long while, taking in the wide, endless view. "It is," she said, finally, quietly, like standing inside a held breath. Finn never forgot her saying that. It became in time exactly how he too came to think of the lantern room. A held breath, patient, suspended, waiting gently for whatever came next. They raised children in the small stone rooms at the base of the tower. Children who grew up the way Finn himself had grown up, climbing the long spiral stair on quiet evenings, watching the steady amber glow of the lantern, asking the particular curious questions that children in that tower always seemed to ask. Their youngest boy, named Dax, was perhaps the most curious of all. He liked to press his small palm flat against the thick curved glass of the lantern room's great window and feel the particular gentle warmth that seemed always to radiate outward from the lantern into the surrounding cooler air. "Where does it go?" he asked once, watching the long slow beam sweep out across the darkening water. "Out," Finn told him gently, "as far as it need to be." Does it ever get tired? Finn smiled at that. No, he said. Some things don't. Dax considered this for a long moment, his small palm still resting against the warm glass. And then he simply nodded the way children do when an answer, however strange, feels entirely satisfying. The light did not only reach distant sailors and homesick soldiers in far-off garrisons. It reached to the people of Merrow in itself. There was a widow in the village named Selah, who lived alone in a small, quiet cottage near the edge of the harbor since her husband, a fisherman, had passed gently in his sleep some years before. She missed him most in the evenings, that particular quiet hour when the day's small tasks were finished and the cottage grew still and the empty chair across from her own seemed somehow more empty than it did at any other time. But each evening, when the light of the Ember Tower appeared glowing softly, first and then more steadily through her small kitchen window, she felt something in her chest loosen, just slightly, enough to let the evening continue, enough to make a small, quiet supper and sit a while longer in her low chair by the window watching that steady, distant glow. She never spoke of this to anyone, but on the nights she slept most deeply, most peacefully, she often woke with a faint, warm impression of a dream she could not quite remember. Only the feeling it left behind. Warm, steady, held, and the light continued. Passed gently from one patient pair of hands to the next, generation after generation, never once going dark. Finn kept the tower until he too grew old. His hands in time grew as withered as Elowen's once had. His hair turned the color of sea foam. Dax, by then a grown man himself, with patient hands and quick, curious eyes of his own, long since taken over most of the daily tending. But Finn still climbed the long spiral stair most evenings, slower now, pausing more often to rest at the small round windows. And Tamsin climbed beside him. They sat together on the low wooden stool, and its neighboring ledge, watching the light the way they had watched it together for so many patient years. "It is," she said once again, many years after first saying it, still like standing inside a held breeze. Finn only smiled and took her hand. They passed gently within a season of each other, the way some long married couples do, as if having shared so much of life together, they found it easiest simply to share its ending too. Dax found them both at peace in the small stone rooms at the base of the tower where they had raised their children and lived their long quiet lives. He grieved deeply, but that same evening, as the sun began its slow golden fade, he climbed the long spiral stair and tended the light. Sailors still spoke of the dream in quiet taverns, in distant ports along coastlines far from Merrow's end, of a tall dark tower, a warm amber light, a feeling of being gently and completely safe. They did not always know where the dream came from, but they slept more easily after it. And it was not only sailors who spoke of the dream. There was a story told of a young soldier named Isaac, stationed for many long months in a cold, distant garrison, far from any coastline at all. He had never in his life seen the sea, had never heard of Merrow's End or the Ember Tower or the quiet, patient woman who had tended its light for so many generations. But on the hardest nights of his long homesick, posting when sleep would not easily come, and his thoughts circled restlessly around everything he missed and everything he feared. He dreamed all the same of a tall, dark tower on a wind-swept headland, of a warm amber light that did not waver, of a feeling he had no easy word for except perhaps the word held. He never understood where the dream came from. He was not a sailor. He had no connection to the sea at all. But he came in time to welcome that dream on his hardest nights, to wait for it almost, the way you wait for a familiar comforting voice. And though he never knew it and never could have known it, somewhere along that quiet coastline, a keeper he would never meet tended faithfully a light that reached further than any ordinary flame ever could, further than the sea, further than the coast, into the wide unmapped territory of anyone's tired searching dreams. When Isaac's long service finally ended, he made a decision that surprised even himself. Rather than returning directly home, he traveled first towards the coast. Any coast. He did not know which one held the tower from his dream. He did not even know if such a tower truly existed anywhere at all. But he walked for many days, until at last he crested a low grassy hill and saw for the very first time in his life the sea. Wide, grey-blue, endless. He stood there for a long while, simply breathing the salt air, feeling something in his chest that he had no easy word for. He never did find the Ember Tower itself. His travels took him to a different stretch of that same long coastline. But standing there at the edge of the wide, unfamiliar water, he felt complete all the same, as if some long unspoken question had finally, quietly resolved itself. He settled in a small coastal town, not far from where he first saw the sea, learned in time to fish, learned to love the particular unhurried rhythm of a life lived near water, and on the hardest of his remaining difficult nights, the dream still found him, the tall dark tower, the warm amber light. Only now he understood a little better where it came from, even if he never saw it with his own waking eyes. And somewhere far along that quiet coastline, in a small round room, At the very top of an old weathered tower, the light continued, steady, patient, warm, tended faithfully by whoever happened to hold the keeping in that particular generation, never asking for gratitude, never needing to be seen, simply continuing. Because some lights, the oldest lights, the ones that have been burning long enough to have become something more than light, do not need a reason. They simply continue. And somewhere tonight, far along a coastline that doesn't appear on any map, that light is still burning, steady, patient, warm. And if you listen closely now, in this quiet room of your own, you might notice that your own breathing has begun to slow, that your own eyes have grown heavy, in that same easy, inevitable way, that has nothing to do with effort, and everything to do with simply allowing it. Somewhere tonight, the Ember Tower's light is searching gently through the wide dark space of dreams for anyone who needs it, for anyone far from home, for anyone carrying something heavy, for anyone who simply needs to know that somewhere someone is still tending a light from them. Tonight, that light has found you. You do not need to do anything, only to rest, only to let your body grow heavy, your breathing grow slow, your thoughts grow soft and quiet, and further apart. You are safe, you are held. Picture, if you like, the long spiral stair of the Ember Tower winding gently upward into the warm amber dark. You do not need to climb it. You are already exactly where you need to be. But if it helps you imagine the smooth, warm stone steps beneath an easy and hurried tread, the small round windows framing brief, quiet glimpses of a calm, dark sea, the particular soft air growing warmer and warmer the higher you climbed, until at last the lantern room opens around you, wide, circular, filled entirely with that same deep amber glow. You could sit if you wanted on the low wooden stool, worn smooth by so many patient keepers before you, and simply watch the light. Feel its warmth settle over you, like a hand, like a held breath, like the particular quiet comfort of knowing that somewhere someone is always watching over the dark so that you do not have to. Somewhere warm and steady, and the patient is watching over you tonight, the way it always has, the way it always will. Let go now, gently, the way the tide lets go of the shore each evening, only to return again. The way Elowen let go in her own warm lantern room. The way Marine once let go of grief and found instead a wide enduring love. The way every quiet keeper in that long unbroken line has eventually Gently let go, trusting that the light will continue without them. You too are allowed to trust that. Whatever you are carrying tonight, whatever small or large weight has followed you into this quiet resting place, you may set it down now. Someone is tending the light. You do not have to. Not tonight. Feel your breathing grow slower still. Feel the small remaining tension in your shoulders, your jaw, your hands soften and release. Feel yourself drifting the way a small paper lantern drifts on calm dark water. Unhurried, untroubled, simply carried gently forward by something larger and more patient than yourself. Sink into the warm amber dark. The lantern will be waiting for you tomorrow night. Sleep well.